A knitter contacted the Knitting Guild while I was at TNNA about doing a course on problems with circular knitting. And I really was kind of confused because exactly what do they mean? They mean like when you're working in a fair isle and how to avoid a jog, something complex like that, or something as simple as how to cast on. I decided to start with the cast on and then maybe move on to other topics later before determining whether we want to do a full-blown video on this. Now, I've cast on onto double-pointed needles, and when you're working in the round, you can either cast on double-pointed needles or you can cast on one circular needle. And if you were using a circular needle, you got a couple of options. You can use a short circular needle where you can spread the stitches down the length of the cable and to the needle so that you can just knit. And if I were knitting, say, something that was going to be 20 inches and I had a 16-inch circular needle, that might work. But often what I'll do is, unless I'm casting on something, say like for a skirt or a dress or a sweater, I will cast on double-pointed needles, and then if I want to switch to circular, I can, and I'm actually going to do that. Now, there are a couple of things that can go wrong. Whenever you read a pattern for knitting in the round, the one thing it'll say is join, being careful not to twist. And what that means is, as you can see, if I'm working on double-pointed needles, it is easy for the stitches to get twisted around. Okay, and I'll show you in a second what happens if you've done this. Now, on a circular needle, if I've got all my stitches on one needle, it's very easy for them to twist around as well. So when it tells you to make sure that they are not twisted, what you want to do is you want to straighten out the cast on, and you want to look and see that the cast on edge is continuous, that you haven't twisted. Hey, George. And if it is, then you want to untwist. And if I'm working on a circular needle, I want to do the same. And I want to make sure, if I'm looking at the smooth side, that I see these little loops continuing, and if they're twisted, you can see that the loop is not exactly continued. Okay, and this is important. So that's one thing you've got to look for. And before I go any further, I want to show you I've worked some. What you can find is you cast on, and if you've twisted stitches, you can be knitting merrily along, and you can encounter something like this. All of a sudden, I'm here, and it's completely twisted around. It's going to look like this. And once you've cast on those stitches, or once you've worked a row or two, and sometimes you don't even notice this and for a couple of rows, it's really too late. You can try and untwist it, but I think most knitters would agree that it's just easier to undo it. So you want to make sure you don't twist your, and there you can see, there you can see what's happened. So you want to make sure that you are not twisting your stitches. And generally, when you discover you've done this, is you've cast on 300 stitches, and then you've got to undo the whole thing. So be very careful when you're working in the round. Now, the next thing with working in the round that can be a problem is, how do I join these two things? And there's a couple of different ways to do this. Myself, what I do is I just knit the next stitch, and I'm going to be knitting and backing out a bit. Make sure that I'm not using my yarn tail, because that's a problem, and that I'm not twisted, and I just work into the next stitch. And of course, it's a little knitsy if you're doing this with double-pointed needles, and I just want to make sure that I pull that as tight as possible and then go on and work. Now, what I do when I'm finished up is I then go in and use this yarn tail to clean up. I kind of darn it in and make it look fine. And I've found that that works just as well as anything. Now, another thing that I will see in some books is to switch the first stitch and the last stitch. So I pull the first stitch and then I pull the last stitch onto this needle, and you can see that I've kind of joined it there, and that's one way to do this. And the other way I've seen to do it is that if you cast on an additional stitch, that you can then knit the two together. So I move my last stitch over here, and then I just knit these two guys together. So those are the ways you can join. Now in the next video I'll talk about how you can use circular needles, how you can transition from one to the other, and other problems that might occur with circular knitting.